My son-in-law hit my daughter at 1 in the morning over his mistress, and he had no idea I owned the company he worked for. Let me say that again, slower, because it's the kind of truth that needs to settle. Bradley Cooper, that's his real name. And yes, I'm using it. Raised his hand to my Sophie at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, screaming about some 26-year-old he was sleeping with, and the entire time he was shoving her against walls and slapping her face hard enough to split her lip. He thought I was just a harmless old widow with too much money and not enough sense. He had no clue that Hartwell Industries, where he collected his $100,000 salary and strutted around like he owned the place, was mine. My name is Virginia Hartwell. I'm 81 years old, and I spent 6 decades building an empire with my late husband, Robert Hahn. Empire that men like Bradley never see coming, because they're too busy underestimating the confused old lady at family dinners. When my phone rang that night, my heart nearly stopped. Nobody calls at 1 in the morning with good news. It was Sophie, my 43-year-old daughter, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. 20 minutes later, I was in her kitchen, holding her face in my hands, these same hands that rocked her as a baby, that applauded at every graduation and, looking at bruises that would take days to fade. That's when I made her a promise that 81 years of life had taught me how to keep. Bradley thought he could hurt my daughter and hide behind threats and intimidation. He thought wrong. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes age for weakness and wisdom for senility. It's about the power nobody sees coming, the kind that's been building quietly for decades while everyone assumed you were just knitting and forgetting things. So if you want to know how a grandmother's love becomes a grandmother's vengeance, the cold, calculated, utterly devastating kind, then stay with me through all 9 chapters of this story. Subscribe, because you're not going to want to miss a single moment of how I dismantled Bradley Cooper's entire life, one careful, deliberate piece at a time. That night in Sophie's kitchen, with my daughter's face swollen and her hands shaking as she held an ice pack to her cheek, I learned the full story. And let me tell you, when you're 81 years old, you've seen enough of life to know real evil when it's sitting right in front of you. Sophie had found messages on Bradley's phone, not even hidden. Well, the man was so arrogant he didn't bother with passwords around her anymore. Hundreds of texts with someone named Amber, his assistant. He'd told Sophie months ago when he started mentioning her name at dinner. 26 years old, fresh out of business school, really sharp with clients. The messages weren't about clients. My daughter, bless her heart, had confronted him that night when he came home late, reeking of perfume that wasn't hers. She'd asked him directly, calmly, if he was having an affair, and that's when he'd exploded, called her crazy, paranoid, a jealous psycho who was inventing problems. Then Sophie made her fatal mistake. She told him she was going to call me, that she was going to tell Virginia what was happening. That's when he hit her. Bradley had grabbed her by the shoulders, shoved her against the kitchen wall so hard a picture frame fell and shattered, and told her she wasn't going to ruin his life over some bullshit. When Sophie tried to push past him to get to her phone, he slapped her across the face, hard. Then he'd leaned in close, and this part made my blood run cold, and told her that if she breathed a word to anyone, especially to the nosy old bitch, he'd destroy her. He had lawyers, he'd said, connections. He'd claim she was mentally unstable, fight for custody of Lucas and Emma, drag her through court until she had nothing left. And who would believe her anyway? Him, a successful regional manager with a spotless reputation, or her, a woman who'd given up her architecture career to support his rise and was now clearly having some kind of breakdown. Then he'd stormed out, just left her there, bleeding and terrified, while he went to God knows where. As Sophie told me all this, I kept my face calm. 81 years teaches you how to hide what you're really feeling, but inside, I was making calculations. Bradley had called me a nosy old bitch. He thought threatening my daughter with lawyers and custody battles would work. He believed his position at some company gave him untouchable power. That last part almost made me laugh. Almost, Sophie, I said, keeping my voice gentle and stroking her hair like I did when she was small. I need you to do something for me. I need you to document these injuries, to photographs, and I want you to go to the doctor tomorrow. Get everything in writing. She pulled back, fear flashing in her eyes. Mom, no, you don't understand. If I push this, he'll take the kids. He said he has resources, that he'll make me look sweetheart. I interrupted. Just trust me. Take the photos. See the doctor. and then don't do anything else. Can you do that for me? She searched my face, confused but too exhausted to argue. Finally, she nodded. I stayed with her that night, made up the guest room, checked on my grandchildren who were somehow still sleeping through all this chaos. Lucas, 15, with his grandfather's stubborn jaw. Emma, 12, with Sophie's artistic soul. They deserved better than a father who could do this. Bradley came home around 4 in the morning. I heard his car in the driveway, listened to him stumble through the front door. He stopped cold when he saw me sitting in the living room armchair, still dressed, wide awake. Virginia, he said, and I could hear him trying to sound sober, concerned, normal. What are you doing here? Is everything okay? I looked at him, Ria, looked at him, 39 years old, handsome in that generic corporate way, wearing a suit that my company's salary had paid for. His tie was loosened, his shirt was wrinkled, and there, just barely visible on his collar, was a smudge of lipstick that definitely wasn't Sophie's shade. Sophie had a fall, I said calmly, using the voice I'd perfected over decades of business negotiations. She called me, upset. I came to help. She's resting now. I watched his face carefully, watched him decide whether to play concerned husband or to challenge the obvious lie. He chose concerned husband, because that's what cowards do. Oh my God, is she okay? I should check on her. She's sleeping, I said firmly. Best not to disturb her. The doctor's appointment is at 9. I'll take her. Something flickered in his eyes then. Calculation. Worry. But he nodded, mumbled something about an early meeting, and headed upstairs. I sat in that chair until sunrise, my old bones aching, my mind absolutely clear. Bradley thought he had power because he wore expensive suits and threw around words like lawyers and resources. He thought a scared woman and an old lady were easy targets. But here's what 60 years of building a business from nothing teaches you. Real power isn't what you display. It's what you keep hidden until the exact right moment to use it. The next morning, after I'd taken Sophie to document her injuries and gotten every photograph and medical report properly filed away, I drove home to my house in Greenwich, same house where Robert and I had raised our children, where we'd celebrated 54 years of marriage before cancer took him 3 years ago. I made myself a cup of tea, sat down at Robert's old desk, and made a phone call. Thomas, I said, when my CEO picked up, I need you to pull the complete file on Bradley Cooper. Every expense report, every performance review, every corporate card transaction for the past 12 months. And Thomas, I need it today. There was only the briefest pause. Thomas Brennan had worked with Robert and me long enough to know that when I asked for something, there was a reason. Of course, Virginia, I'll have it to you by 3. One more thing, I added, my voice still perfectly pleasant. Don't mention this to anyone. Not yet. When I hung up, I sat there in the morning light, thinking about my son-in-law, sleeping peacefully in a bed my daughter's inheritance had helped buy, in a house my company's salary made possible. Bradley Cooper had made 3 fatal mistakes that night. First, he'd hurt my daughter. Second, he'd threatened my grandchildren. And third, this was the big one, he'd assumed that an 81-year-old woman was too old, too soft, and too irrelevant to do anything about it. Thomas delivered the file at 2:30 that afternoon, a full half-hour early. That's the thing about working with the same people for over a decade, they learn when something matters. I spread everything across Robert's old mahogany desk. The same desk where we'd reviewed contracts and made decisions that turned a small manufacturing company into an industrial empire worth $400 million. My reading glasses, the ones Bradley always made jokes about me losing, were exactly where I'd left them that morning. What I found in those first 30 minutes made my tea go cold. 8 months of corporate credit card statements, dinner after dinner at restaurants I recognized as the kind where entrees cost $90, the Capitol Grill, Mastro's Steakhouse, Daniel, always a Tuesday or Thursday night, always the same pattern, 2 people, wine that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. The receipts listed them as client entertainment, but when I cross-referenced with the sales reports Thomas had included, there were no new clients from any of those dinners, not a single one. Then there were the hotels, Miami in March, classified as a regional sales conference. I'd been getting reports from Hartwell Industries for 40 years. I knew we didn't have regional sales conferences in Miami in March. We had them in Chicago in September, same as always, but there was Bradley's expense report, 5 nights at the Fontainebleau, Ocean View Suite, $3,200 plus another $1,800 in entertainment expenses. I pulled up the employee roster Thomas had included. Found Amber Mitchell, 26 years old, hired as Bradley's assistant 11 months ago, salary of $54,000. There was her request for time off in March, personal days, the same exact dates as Bradley's conference. My hands weren't shaking. They haven't shaken since I negotiated my first $1 million contract in 1979, but something cold was settling in my chest. I kept digging. Expense reports going back 18 months. Bradley had been creative. I'd give him that. Inflated mileage claims. Meals with potential clients whose names, when I had Thomas's assistant check, didn't exist in any business registry. Office supplies that were never delivered to any Hartwell facility. Equipment repairs for machinery we didn't own. I spent 3 hours with my calculator, the old-fashioned kind, because I've never trusted spreadsheets the way I trust numbers. I can see myself and added it up. $43,000. That's how much my son-in-law had stolen from my company while sleeping in my daughter's bed and eating at my family's table. But I needed more than numbers. Numbers could be explained away, blamed on accounting errors, turned into a he said she said about business practices. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. That's when I called David Chen. David was 74, a private investigator who'd worked with Robert back in the 90s when we'd had a supplier trying to breach a contract. He was semi-retired now, spent most of his time with his grandchildren, but when I explained what I needed, his voice went hard in a way I remembered. He told me he'd have preliminary information in 72 hours. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I had dinner with Sophie and the kids on Wednesday night, watched Bradley come home late with apologies about inventory issues at the warehouse. He kissed Sophie's forehead, right near the bruise that makeup was barely covering, and asked if she was feeling better. After her fall, I smiled at him over my pot roast and asked how work was going. He launched into some story about landing a new client, expanding territories, how he was being considered for a promotion to VP level. Every word out of his mouth was so sincere, so earnest. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed him. That's when I understood something that made my blood run even colder than the hit itself. Bradley wasn't just violent. He was a pathological liar, so practiced at deception that he probably half believed his own stories. Friday afternoon, David called. He told me to come to his office, that this wasn't something to discuss over the phone. The envelope he handed me was thick. I opened it right there, and what I saw made 60 years of professional composure almost crack. Photographs, Bradley and Amber having lunch at outdoor cafes, his hand on her thigh under the table. Bradley and Amber leaving a hotel in Stamford at 2 in the afternoon on a workday. Bradley and Amber kissing in a parking garage I recognized as the one beneath Hartwell's regional office. Bank statements. Bradley had opened an account at a different bank, one Sophie clearly didn't know about. Deposits that matched exactly with his quarterly bonuses from Hartwell. The account was joined with Amber Mitchell. But the worst part, the part that made me understand this wasn't just an affair, was the transcript David had obtained through methods I didn't ask about. A conversation between Bradley and Amber, recorded 2 weeks before he hit Sophie. Bradley's voice saying that once the old lady died and Sophie inherited everything, they'd be set for life. That Sophie was so dependent on him, she'd never see it coming. That he'd drain the accounts and they'd disappear, maybe to the Cayman Islands, maybe to Costa Rica, somewhere without extradition. Amber had laughed, asked if he was serious, and Bradley had said, absolutely. He'd been planning this for over a year, ever since he realized just how much money Virginia Hartwell was really worth. I sat in David's office, looking at photographs and transcripts, and thought about the man who'd eaten at my table for 6 years, who'd held my grandchildren as babies, who'd given the toast at my 80th birthday party about how lucky he was to be part of such an amazing family. He'd been planning to destroy my daughter all along. David was watching me carefully, probably worried about my blood pressure or my heart or whatever else people worry about with 81-year-old women. He asked if I was okay, if I needed water. I told him I was fine. I told him I needed 3 copies of everything, each in a separate sealed envelope, one for my attorney, one for the district attorney's office, and one for me to deliver personally. Then I asked him one more question. How long would it take to arrange for Sophie to have a security expert change all her locks and install cameras without Bradley knowing? David said he could have it done Sunday afternoon when Bradley would be at his weekly golf game, the one he claimed was networking but that my investigation showed was usually just him and Amber at a no-tell motel off Route 95. I thanked him, paid him double his usual rate because good work deserves good pay, something Robert and I always believed. And I drove home thinking about Sunday dinner. Because here's what 81 years teaches you. Revenge isn't about screaming or confrontation or dramatic scenes. It's about preparation. It's about making absolutely sure that when you strike, there's no possible recovery. Bradley thought he was smart. Thought he'd found the perfect mark: a rich old widow, a trusting daughter with low self-esteem, and a company where he could steal enough to fund his exit strategy. What he didn't understand was that I hadn't built Hartwell Industries by being soft or trusting or naive. I'd built it by being patient, thorough, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. And he'd just made it necessary. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made breakfast for my children every morning for 30 years, where Robert and I had our coffee before dawn strategy sessions, and I made a list, not on a computer, on paper, with a pen, the way I'd always planned the most important moves. Step 1, Sunday dinner. The whole family, like always. Step 2, make sure Richard, my attorney's son, was there with the right paperwork. Step 3, make absolutely certain Bradley had no warning, no chance to prepare, no room to maneuver. I folded that list and put it in the same drawer where I kept Robert's reading glasses, the ones I'd saved after he died because sometimes I needed to feel close to him. Then, I whispered to the empty kitchen, to the ghost of my husband who'd loved Sophie as fiercely as I did, that this was going to be for all of us. Bradley Cooper thought he could hit my daughter at 1 in the morning and get away with it because I was just a confused old woman. He was about to learn that confused old women built the world he was living in, and we could take it apart just as easily. Sunday morning, I woke up at 5:30 like I have every day for the past 60 years. My knees ached, they always do now, and it took me a full minute to get out of bed. Sometimes I look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. When did I get so old? When did my hands get these age spots, these prominent veins? But then I remembered what was in the envelope locked in Robert's desk, and suddenly I felt 30 years younger. I spent the morning cooking pot roast, the way I'd made it every Sunday for decades, roasted potatoes with rosemary from my garden, green beans, apple pie from scratch because Emma loved my apple pie and I wanted her to have good memories of this day, even if the rest of it was going to be hard. Sophie called around 10 to confirm they were coming. Her voice was still small, uncertain in a way that broke my heart. She asked if she should bring anything, and I told her just to bring herself and my babies. She said Bradley was looking forward to it, that he'd been in such a good mood lately. Of course he had been. According to David's last report, he and Amber had just booked plane tickets to Grand Cayman for December, right after the holidays, to one-way tickets. They weren't planning to come back. Richard arrived first, my 50-year-old son with his father's steady eyes and his mother's spine of steel. He worked in corporate law, specializing in white-collar crime, and when I'd briefed him on everything I'd found, I'd watched his face go through shock, rage, and finally that cold professional calculation that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. He'd brought the papers I'd requested: termination for cause, documentation of every fraudulent expense, criminal complaint for embezzlement and fraud, restraining order based on Sophie's medical records and photographs, everything sealed, legal, and absolutely devastating. We didn't talk about it while we waited, just set the table together like we had hundreds of times before. And I told him stories about when he and Sophie were little, running through this same dining room. Robert chasing them and roaring like a monster while they shrieked with laughter. Sophie, Bradley, and the kids arrived at 1. Lucas had shot up another 2 inches, I swear. And Emma immediately wrapped herself around me, the way she'd been doing since she could walk. Bradley came in carrying wine, expensive wine, I noticed, probably charged to his Hartwell corporate card, and kissed my cheek like he always did. He told me I looked beautiful, asked how I was feeling, had I remembered to take my medications, was I managing okay in this big house all alone. His voice was so concerned, so caring, like he genuinely worried about the confused old widow. I patted his hand and told him I was managing just fine, thank you. Dinner was pleasant. I'd invited them at 1 specifically because I wanted plenty of time, wanted everything relaxed and normal. We ate slowly. I asked Lucas about school, listened to Emma talk about her art project, Bradley dominated most of the conversation, talking about work, about a huge deal he was closing, about how the company was really starting to recognize his value. I made appropriate grandmother noises, asked questions that made him elaborate, let him dig himself deeper into the lies while I passed the potatoes and refilled water glasses. Sophie was quiet, picking at her food. The bruise on her cheek was almost gone, but I could still see it if I looked closely. Every time I did, I felt that cold determination settle deeper in my chest. Around 3, while Sophie and the kids were clearing dishes, Bradley excused himself to take a call. I watched him step onto the back porch, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something. Through the window, I could see him pacing, relaxed, confident. He had no idea what was coming. When he came back inside, I was setting out dessert apple pie with vanilla ice cream. I served everyone, made sure the kids had plenty, and then I placed a manila envelope on the table next to Bradley's plate. He looked at it, then at me, smiling that easy smile. Asked if this was an early birthday present, maybe a nice check from his favorite mother-in-law. I told him to open it. The room went very quiet. Sophie stopped halfway through taking a bite of pie. Richard was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, positioned exactly where we'd planned. Lucas and Emma were focused on their desserts, blessedly oblivious. Bradley opened the envelope. I watched his face as he pulled out the first page, the termination letter on Hartwell Industries letterhead. Watched the confusion, then the dawning horror as he flipped through the pages. Expense reports highlighted in yellow, bank statements, photographs, the transcript. His face went from tan to gray in about 30 seconds. Sophie was staring at him, then at me, clearly lost. Richard quietly suggested that maybe Lucas and Emma would like to watch a movie in the den. And before anyone could object, he'd ushered them out of the room with promises of popcorn. When the dining room door closed, Bradley finally found his voice. He asked what this was, what kind of sick joke I was playing. His hands were shaking, making the papers rattle. I stood up, slowly, because my knees needed a moment, but I stood up and I looked at him directly. I told him it was termination paperwork from Hartwell Industries, that he was fired, effective immediately, for embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of corporate funds totaling $43,000, that the company I owned, yes, I owned it, had owned it since Robert and I built it from nothing in 1963, was pressing criminal charges. I watched understanding hit him, watched him realize that the confused old lady he'd been condescending to for 6 years was actually his boss, that every dollar he'd stolen, every lie he'd told, every expensive dinner with his mistress had been funded by my company. He started to say something, but I wasn't finished. I told him that the second envelope contained a restraining order based on the medical evidence of what he'd done to my daughter, that he had assaulted Sophie, and I had photographs, doctor's reports, and a statement she'd finally agreed to make official, that he needed to stay at least 500 feet away from her and my grandchildren. Sophie made a small sound. Her hand went to her mouth. Bradley's face went from gray to red. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward, and for a second I thought he might actually try something. But Richard stepped forward from the doorway, and Bradley seemed to remember that my son was 6'2" and had played defensive end in college. Bradley turned to Sophie instead, his voice going desperate. He told her this was insane, that her crazy mother was making things up, that those expense reports were mistakes, that Amber was just a colleague, that the whole thing about hitting her was a misunderstanding. Sophie just stared at him. Then she looked at me, and I slid a photograph across the table. Bradley and Amber kissing in a parking garage, his hand on her face in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate. I told Sophie there were dozens more where that came from, that Bradley had been planning to leave her all along, as soon as he could drain her inheritance, that he'd been stealing from my company for over a year to fund his exit strategy. The sound Sophie made then was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Bradley tried a different approach. His voice went soft, pleading. He told me I was old, that I was confused about how businesses worked, that I was misunderstanding normal corporate practices. He suggested gently that perhaps Richard was taking advantage of my declining mental state, that we should all sit down with a mediator. Maybe I needed to see my doctor. That's when I smiled. I told him I'd been running corporations since before he was born, that I'd reviewed every quarterly report from Hartwell Industries for the past 40 years, approved every major decision, hired and fired 3 CEOs, that my declining mental state had grown the company by 230% in the last decade alone, Then I told him he had 15 minutes to leave my house before I called the police and had him arrested for domestic violence, that Sophie's locks had already been changed, that his belongings were being packed by a service and would be delivered to whatever address he provided, but he would never set foot in that house again. Richard handed him the restraining order then, all official and legal and impossible to ignore. Bradley looked at Sophie one more time, tried to catch her eye, to get her to defend him, to say something in his favor. My daughter, my strong, beautiful daughter who'd been beaten down and terrified, just days ago, looked at him with something I hadn't seen in her face in years. Clarity. She told him to get out. That's when Bradley's mask finally cracked completely. He called me a vindictive old bitch, said I'd poisoned Sophie against him, that I was a controlling monster who couldn't stand to see my daughter happy. He knocked over his chair deliberately and said he'd fight this, that he'd drag me through court, that he knew people, had lawyers, had resources. I just kept smiling, because at 81 years old, I'd learned something important. Men like Bradley think volume equals power. They think threats and rage and physical intimidation are strength. They're wrong. I told him his lawyers could call my lawyers, that he'd be hearing from the district attorney's office by Wednesday, and that every second he stayed in my house now was trespassing, which I'd be delighted to add to his growing list of legal problems. Richard escorted him out. I heard Bradley's voice in the hallway, still arguing, still making threats. Then the front door closed and it was quiet except for Sophie crying softly at the table. I sat back down next to my daughter and held her hand, the same way I'd held it 60 years ago when she'd scraped her knee, 40 years ago when her first boyfriend broke her heart, 6 years ago when Robert died and we'd cried together. After a while, she asked me how long I'd known about Hartwell Industries, about the company being mine. I told her the truth, that Robert and I had structured it through a trust decades ago for tax and liability purposes, that most people at the company knew, but we'd kept it quiet socially because we liked our privacy, that I'd never mentioned it because it never mattered until it did. She laughed then, a real laugh, and said Bradley must have had a heart attack when he saw my signature on that termination letter. I said I certainly hoped so. Lucas and Emma came back eventually, confused about why Bradley had left without saying goodbye. Sophie told them their father had to deal with some work problems and that they'd talk about everything tomorrow. She was using her strong voice again, the one I remembered from before. Bradley had spent 6 years cutting her down. After they left going home to a house with new locks and a security system Bradley didn't know about Richard, and I cleaned up the dinner dishes. He told me I'd been magnificent, that Dad would have been proud. I told him Dad had taught me everything I knew about wielding power. That night, lying in bed in the house where I'd spent 54 years of marriage, where I'd raised my children and buried my husband, I thought about Bradley discovering that his paychecks had stopped, that his corporate card was declined, that the company he'd bragged about would now be the source of criminal charges. I thought about Amber getting phone calls from a man who suddenly had no money, no job, and no future. And I thought about Sophie, finally, free to rebuild her life without a man who'd been planning her destruction from the beginning. At 81, I'd learned that you don't win by being louder or stronger or more violent. You win by being smarter, more patient, and absolutely unwilling to let cruelty go unpunished. Bradley had thought an old woman was harmless. He'd just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. The week after that Sunday dinner felt like the calm before a storm. I was still orchestrating. Bradley had been removed from the immediate picture, but I knew men like him didn't just disappear quietly. They regrouped, they plotted, they found lawyers who'd tell them what they wanted to hear. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. Monday morning, I had breakfast with Thomas Brennan at the same diner where Robert and I used to meet suppliers back in the 70s. Thomas arrived with another folder, this one even thicker than the first. He told me Bradley had already retained an attorney, some aggressive type from Stanford who specialized in wrongful termination suits. They were claiming the firing was personal retaliation, that the expense reports were within normal business practices, that I was a grieving widow being manipulated by my son who had his own agenda. I sipped my coffee and asked Thomas what our legal team thought. He said we had Bradley dead to rights on the fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. But Bradley's lawyer was going to make it ugly, drag it out, try to paint me as a confused elderly woman who didn't understand modern business. They'd already filed a motion claiming I lacked the mental competence to make termination decisions. That made me smile. See, that was exactly what I'd been counting on. I told Thomas I wanted to move forward with the criminal charges. No settlements, no quiet resolutions. I wanted Bradley prosecuted to the fullest extent, and I wanted our legal team to prepare for a countersuit defamation if he kept claiming I was mentally incompetent. Thomas looked worried. He reminded me I was 81, that a prolonged legal battle would be stressful, that maybe we should consider a settlement that would make this go away quickly. I reminded him that I'd been handling stress since before he was born, that I'd negotiated with union leaders, corporate raiders, and government regulators for 6 decades, that Bradley Cooper's bargain basement lawyer didn't scare me in the slightest. Thomas nodded slowly. He said he'd relay everything to our attorneys and that they'd be aggressive. After he left, I sat in that diner booth a little longer, remembering when Robert and I had been young and building something from nothing. How many times had people underestimated us because we didn't have the right pedigree, the fancy degrees, the old money connections? How many times had we proven them wrong by simply working harder and smarter than everyone else? Bradley's lawyer thought age was a weakness. He was about to discover it was actually 8 decades of accumulated knowledge, connections, and resources. That afternoon, I visited Sophie at the house. She was actually painting, for the first time in years. The canvas was abstract, all angry reds and blues, but it was art. She was creating again. The kids were at school. Sophie had told them their father was dealing with serious work problems and would be away for a while. Lucas had asked pointed questions. Emma had cried. But both of them seemed almost relieved, and that told me they'd witnessed more than Sophie had wanted to admit over the years. We had tea in her kitchen, and Sophie told me Bradley had been calling constantly. Voicemails that ranged from apologetic to threatening. He'd violated the restraining order twice already, driving past the house slowly, and she'd called the police both times. They'd documented it but hadn't arrested him yet. I told her they would. That every violation was building a case. That patience was important now. Then Sophie asked me the question I'd been expecting. How much was this going to cost me? The lawyers, the investigators, the legal battle ahead. I told her the truth. Maybe 200,000 by the time everything was finished. Maybe more if Bradley dragged it out. She started crying again, said she couldn't let me spend that much money because of her marriage falling apart. I took her hands, my old veined hands holding her younger, paint-stained ones, and I told her something I needed her to understand, that money was just money, that I had more than I could ever spend in whatever years I had left, but my daughter, my grandchildren, their safety and happiness, that was priceless. Besides, I said, this wasn't charity. This was justice, and justice is always worth paying for. What I didn't tell her was that I'd also instructed my attorney to start proceedings to ensure she'd inherit the majority of my estate when I died, with trusts set up for Lucas and Emma that Bradley could never touch, that I was restructuring everything to make sure my family was protected, not just now, but for generations. Because that's what you do when you're 81 and you've built something that matters. You make sure it goes to people who deserve it. Wednesday brought the news I'd been waiting for. The district attorney's office had reviewed our evidence and was moving forward with criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, 3 counts of each. If convicted, Bradley was looking at 5 to 10 years. His lawyer immediately requested a meeting, wanted to discuss a plea bargain. Bradley would resign quietly, repay the $43,000, and we'd drop all charges. I told our lawyers absolutely not. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about consequences. Thursday, I got a call from Amber Mitchell's mother. That was unexpected. She'd somehow gotten my personal number, probably from Bradley, and she wanted to tell me that her daughter was a good girl who'd made a mistake, that Bradley had pursued her, that Amber hadn't known he was married at first. I listened politely. 81 years teaches you when to speak and when to just let people talk themselves out. When she finished, I told her gently that I wasn't angry at her daughter, that Amber was 26 and had been manipulated by a practiced liar, but that I hoped Amber had learned something about the character of men who cheat on their wives. The mother was quiet for a moment. Then she told me Amber had quit her job at Hartwell Industries 2 days after Bradley was fired, that she'd moved back home, that Bradley had been calling her constantly, angry that she wouldn't help him, wouldn't testify on his behalf, wouldn't stand by him now that his money was gone. I thanked her for calling. After I hung up, I thought about Ambion, probably thinking she'd found an exciting older man with money and prospects, not realizing she was just a tool in someone else's con game. Bradley was losing his support system. Good Friday afternoon brought a development I hadn't anticipated. Bradley's parents called Richard. They wanted a family meeting, wanted to mediate, thought surely we could all work this out like adults. Richard told them there was nothing to mediate. Their son had committed crimes and would face the consequences. They insisted he was a good man who'd made mistakes, that we were ruining his life over what amounted to expense account discrepancies. That's when I got on the phone myself. I told Bradley's mother, Patricia, a woman I'd had cordial relations with for 6 years, that her son had physically assaulted my daughter, that I had medical records, that everything else aside, he'd hit Sophie hard enough to bruise her face and split her lip. There was a long silence. Then Patricia asked in a small voice if I was sure, if maybe Sophie had exaggerated. I told her I'd seen the bruises with my own eyes, that I'd held my crying daughter at 1 in the morning, that there was no exaggeration possible. She hung up without another word. An hour later, Bradley's father called back. He told Richard that if the criminal charges proceeded, they'd be forced to mortgage their house to pay for Bradley's legal defense, that we were destroying their retirement over a family dispute. Richard, bless him, told them their son had destroyed his own life through his own choices, that actions have consequences, that maybe they should have raised him better. It was harsh, but it was true. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I visited Robert's grave. The cemetery was quiet, just me and the October wind and the stone that read Robert James Hartwell, beloved husband and father. I told him everything about Bradley, about Sophie, about how I'd used everything he'd taught me to protect our family. I told him I wished he was here to see Sophie getting strong again, to see Lucas and Emma safe, to see justice actually working the way it was supposed to. Then I told him I was tired, that 81 felt heavier than 80 had, that sometimes I wondered if all this fighting was worth the energy it cost. But I knew the answer. Of course it was worth it, because some things are worth being tired for. On my way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought new locks for my own house. Not because I thought Bradley would come after me, he wasn't that stupid, but because it felt symbolic. Locking out the past, securing the future. That night, I made a list of everyone I still needed to talk to. Sophie's divorce attorney, to make sure the proceedings were airtight. My financial advisor, to restructure my estate properly. Thomas, to discuss Bradley's replacement at Hartwell Industries, and to make sure everyone at the company understood that retaliation against Sophie would result in immediate termination. I also wrote a letter to Lucas and Emma, sealed it, dated it, put it in my safe. It explained everything, why I'd done what I did, what I hoped they'd learn from it, how much I loved them, just in case something happened to me before this was all over. Because at 81, you think about those things. You make sure your final words are ready, just in case you don't get to choose the timing. But I wasn't planning on going anywhere soon. Not until I saw Bradley Cooper behind bars, or at least broken enough that he'd never hurt another woman again. That weekend ended with a call from David Chen. He'd continued monitoring Bradley, even though I'd already paid him in full. He wanted me to know that Bradley had been seen at a bar in Stamford, drunk, telling anyone who'd listen that he was being persecuted by a vindictive old bitch who didn't understand business. David asked if I wanted him to document it. I told him yes, document everything, because men who can't control their mouths when they're drunk usually end up providing the best evidence against themselves. Bradley was unraveling, and I was just getting started. 2 weeks after that Sunday dinner, Bradley made his first major mistake in the legal battle. His attorney filed a motion claiming I was mentally incompetent to make business decisions, citing my age and what they called erratic behavior in firing him without proper corporate procedure. They actually put it in writing, submitted it to the court, claimed that an 81-year-old woman couldn't possibly understand complex corporate finance well enough to identify fraud. Our legal team called it a gift. Within 48 hours, Thomas had assembled a presentation of every major business decision I'd made in the past 5 years. Acquisitions that had increased Hartwell's value by $90 million, cost-cutting measures that had saved jobs during the 2020 pandemic, strategic pivots that had positioned us ahead of our competitors, all documented, all successful, all with my signature and detailed notes proving I understood exactly what I was approving. Richard scheduled a competency hearing at my request. If Bradley wanted to claim I was senile, we'd let a judge examine the evidence. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I wore the same Chanel suit I'd worn to Robert's funeral, navy blue. Perfectly tailored. The one that made me look like exactly what I was. A woman who'd built an empire and wasn't apologizing for it. Bradley's attorney looked nervous when he saw me walk in. Maybe he'd expected a confused old woman in a house. Instead, he got someone who'd been intimidating corporate lawyers since before he was born. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Catherine Morrison. I'd actually met her years ago at a charity function. She didn't acknowledge that, of course, but I saw recognition in her eyes. Bradley's lawyer presented his case, argued that my sudden firing of Bradley suggested impulsive decision, that I'd allegedly made the choice based on family drama rather than sound business judgment, that someone my age couldn't be expected to understand modern corporate structures. Then our attorney presented the counter-evidence, my business record, testimonials from Thomas and 3 other executives about my mental acuity, financial statements I'd personally annotated, strategic memos I'd written, a cognitive assessment I'd voluntarily taken that showed my mental capacity was well above average for any age. Judge Morrison asked me directly if I understood the charges against Bradley. I explained, in detail, the difference between legitimate business expenses and fraud. Cited specific instances from his expense reports. Referenced relevant corporate policies. Did it all without notes, because I'd memorized every number that mattered. Then she asked why I'd waited to fire him. I told her the truth, that I'd needed time to build an airtight case, that rushing would have given him room to claim wrongful termination, that patience and thoroughness aren't signs of incompetence, they're signs of experience. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Judge Morrison ruled that I was clearly competent and that Bradley's motion was frivolous at best, possibly acceptable. She warned his attorney about wasting the court's time with baseless claims. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt younger than I had in years. But Bradley's humiliation in court made him dangerous in other ways. That weekend, he showed up at Sophie's house despite the restraining order. Lucas called me, frightened, saying his father was outside yelling about wanting to see his kids. Sophie had already called the police. I told Lucas to stay inside, keep the doors locked, that I was on my way. I arrived before the police did. Bradley was in the driveway, pacing, agitated. When he saw me, his face twisted into something ugly. He started toward me, yelling about how I'd poisoned his children against him, how I'd destroyed his life, how I was a controlling monster who couldn't let go. I stood my ground, 81 years old, 5'4", probably 120 pounds, and I didn't move an inch. I told him the police were coming, that he was violating a restraining order, that every word he was screaming was being recorded by Sophie's new security cameras. He called me names I won't repeat, said things about Sophie that made my blood boil, threatened to make sure I regretted ever interfering in his marriage. Then the police arrived. They arrested him right there in Sophie's driveway while Lucas and Emma watched from the window. That night, drinking tea in Sophie's kitchen while my grandchildren finally slept upstairs, I realized something important. Bradley wasn't just losing, he was making it worse for himself with every move. The restraining order violation meant jail time, even if brief. It meant the criminal case against him got stronger. It meant the divorce proceedings would favor Sophie even more completely. Men like Bradley never learned that sometimes the best strategy is to surrender quietly. They can't help themselves. They have to keep fighting, keep threatening, keep trying to intimidate, and every time they do, they hand you another weapon. Sophie asked me if I was scared of him. I told her the truth. I'd been scared when I thought he might hurt her again, but now, I just felt tired and determined. Bradley Cooper had started a war with someone who'd been winning battles since before he was born. And wars, I'd learned over 8 decades, aren't won by the loudest or the angriest. They're won by whoever's still standing when the smoke clears. November came with cold rain and the kind of gray skies that match serious business. Bradley had spent 3 days in jail for violating the restraining order, and when he got out, something in him had shifted. The angry calls stopped. The drunken voicemails ended. The drive-bys past Sophie's house ceased. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally accepted reality. Then David Chen called and told me what was really happening. Bradley had hired a crisis management consultant, some expensive firm out of Manhattan that specialized in reputation repair for executives. They were coaching him on how to appear sympathetic, how to rebuild his image, how to position himself as the victim of a vindictive family dispute. He'd cleaned up, started attending AA meetings very publicly, where people would notice, volunteered at a soup kitchen and made sure local press covered it, posted on social media about personal growth and learning from mistakes and fighting for his children. It was all calculated, all strategic, and it might have worked on someone who didn't have 60 years of seeing through corporate manipulation. I called an emergency meeting with Richard and our legal team, told them Bradley was planning something, that this sudden transformation was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Our lead attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance who'd been with us for 15 years, said Bradley's team had filed for a custody hearing. They were going to argue that Sophie was alienating the children from their father, that I was controlling the situation, that Bradley deserved shared custody despite the restraining order. They had witnesses lined up. Bradley's parents would testify about what a devoted father he'd been. His new therapist would talk about his commitment to change. Even his AA sponsor after just 3 weeks would speak about his dedication to recovery. It was theater. Expensive, well-choreographed theater designed to make a judge sympathetic. Richard asked what I wanted to do. The criminal trial was still months away. The divorce proceedings were ongoing, but this custody hearing could happen within weeks. And if Bradley won even partial custody, it would undermine everything else. I sat in that conference room, looking at the faces of lawyers who'd worked with Robert and me for years, and I thought about timing, about patience, about waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Then I remembered something David had mentioned weeks ago, something I'd filed away but not acted on yet. I asked Patricia if Bradley's character could be introduced as evidence in a custody hearing. She said absolutely his fitness as a parent was the central question. I told her I needed 48 hours, that I had something that would end this permanently, but I needed to confirm it first. That afternoon, I called David, asked him about the detail he'd mentioned about Bradley's behavior at that bar in Stamford. He said Bradley had been there multiple times, always drunk, always bitter, always running his mouth. I asked if any of those times had been since his arrest, since his supposed transformation and commitment to sobriety. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd check and call me back. 3 hours later, my phone rang. David told me Bradley had been at that same bar 5 nights ago. Thursday night, the same week he'd attended his very public AA meeting on Tuesday. He'd been drunk enough that the bartender had called him a cab, drunk enough that he'd gotten into an argument with another patron about crazy ex-wives and the system being rigged against men. David had the bartender's statement, the cab company's records, security camera footage from the bar's parking lot showing Bradley stumbling to the cab. I asked if he could get all of that documented and notarized within 24 hours. He said he'd have it by morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was worried I was past worry by then, but because I was making calculations. The custody hearing was in 12 days. Bradley's entire defense rested on his transformation narrative. His sobriety, his commitment to change, his dedication to being a better man for his children, all of it was a lie, and I was about to prove it. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I put on my full business armor, the Chanel suit, the pearls Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary, heels that made my feet ache but added 3 inches, hair and makeup done by the same woman who'd prepared me for board meetings back when I still attended them in person. I looked in the mirror and saw the woman I'd been at 40, at 50, at 60, the one who'd walked into rooms full of men who underestimated her and walked out having gotten exactly what she wanted. Then I drove to Stamford and did something that would have made Robert laugh. I went to that bar myself. Middle of the afternoon, nearly empty, just me and the bartender David had interviewed. His name was Mike. He was maybe 35, looked tired, probably worked 2 jobs. I introduced myself, showed him my ID, and asked if we could talk. I told him about Bradley, about what he'd done to my daughter, about the custody hearing where Bradley would claim to be sober and reformed, about how men like Bradley count on people not wanting to get involved. Mike listened. Then he asked what I needed. I told him I needed him to testify, to tell a judge what he'd seen, to confirm that Bradley's sobriety was a performance. He was hesitant, said he couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't risk getting involved in legal drama, had his own problems to worry about. I understood. I told him I'd pay him for his time, double whatever he'd lose in wages, cover any expenses. and I'd make sure our attorneys made it as painless as possible. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he said his sister had been in an abusive relationship, that she'd gotten out but barely, that he'd always wished someone had helped her fight back. He'd testify. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not just determination or anger or the cold satisfaction of having a plan. I felt hope, real hope, that this would actually end the way it needed to. That weekend, Sophie asked me if I really thought we could win the custody fight. If Bradley's Transformation Act would fool a judge. I held her hand and told her something I'd learned over 8 decades. The truth always has more power than lies, but only if you're willing to fight hard enough to make people see it. Bradley thought he'd found a strategy: clean up his image, play the reformed man, use the system's sympathy for fathers who claim they're being alienated from their children. What he didn't understand was that I'd been playing this game since before his strategy existed, that I knew every move, every countermove, every way to dismantle a carefully constructed image. The custody hearing was in 10 days. Bradley thought he'd walk in there looking like a changed man seeking redemption. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The custody hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and broken families. I sat behind Sophie, my hand on her shoulder, watching Bradley walk in with his attorney, looking confident and composed. He'd dressed the part perfectly. Conservative suit, nothing flashy, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed. He looked like a man who'd gotten his life together, who deserved a second chance, who just wanted to be a father to his children. The judge was a man named Harold Stevens, early 50s, known for being fair but traditional, the kind who believed in second chances and family reconciliation. Bradley's team had probably requested him specifically. His attorney opened with exactly the strategy we'd anticipated, painted Bradley as a devoted father who'd made mistakes but was committed to change, presented his AA attendance records, called his therapist, who testified about Bradley's genuine remorse and significant progress in just 6 weeks of treatment. Then they called Bradley's mother. Patricia sat in that witness box and talked about how Bradley had always been a loving father, how Lucas and Emma adored him, how she'd witnessed countless bedtime stories and soccer games and father-child bonding. She cried when she talked about how her grandchildren were being kept from their father. It was effective. I watched Judge Stevens taking notes, nodding occasionally, watched him look at Bradley with something that might have been sympathy. Then, it was our turn. Patricia Vance started methodically. She entered the medical records from Sophie's assault into evidence. The photographs of bruises that had taken weeks to fade. The police report from that night. She established not just that Bradley had hit Sophie, but that he'd done it in front of where the children were sleeping upstairs. Bradley's attorney objected, said the assault wasn't relevant to Bradley's capability as a father. Judge Stevens overruled him, said that violence in the home was absolutely relevant to custody decisions. Then Patricia called Sophie. My daughter walked to that witness stand with her head high, and I'd never been more proud of her. She testified about the years of emotional abuse before the physical violence, how Bradley had isolated her from friends, criticized her parenting, made her feel worthless, how Lucas had started having anxiety attacks at school, how Emma had begun drawing pictures of their family with her father scribbled out in black. Bradley's attorney tried to shake her testimony, suggested she was exaggerating, that she was being coached by me, that her perception was colored by anger about the affair. Sophie didn't break. She looked that attorney in the eye and said that bruises don't exaggerate and children's fear doesn't lie. Then Patricia did something brilliant. She asked Sophie about Bradley's drinking. Sophie testified that he'd been drinking heavily for years, that it had gotten worse in the months before the assault, that his promises to quit had never lasted more than a few days. Bradley's attorney objected immediately, said his client had been sober for 6 weeks, that he was actively in recovery, that past behavior wasn't relevant to current custody. That's when Patricia smiled. She said she had evidence that Mr. Cooper's sobriety claims were false, that his entire transformation narrative was a calculated performance designed to manipulate this court. Judge Stevens leaned forward, told her to proceed. Patricia called Mike, the bartender from Stamford. He took the stand looking uncomfortable but determined. He identified Bradley from a photograph, testified that Bradley had been at his bar 5 nights before this hearing, that he'd consumed at least 7 whiskeys over 3 hours, that he'd been drunk enough to require a taxi home. Bradley's face went white. His attorney stood up, objecting that this was hearsay, that there was no proof, that Mike could be mistaken about the date. Patricia entered the bar's security footage into evidence, timestamped, showing Bradley stumbling through the parking lot at 11:40 p.m. on a Thursday night. The same week he'd attended an AA meeting on Tuesday. Then she entered the taxi company's records: pickup location, drop-off location, time, date, Bradley's credit card number on file for payment. Then she entered statements from 2 other patrons who'd been at the bar that night, who'd heard Bradley ranting about his vindictive ex-wife and the old bitch who ruined his life, while he threw back drink after drink. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Bradley's attorney tried to recover, argued that one relapse didn't negate his client's overall commitment to sobriety, that recovery is a process, that this was a minor setback. Patricia looked at Judge Stevens and said that lying to the court about sobriety wasn't a minor setback, it was perjury. It was evidence of a man willing to deceive everyone, including his own attorney, to get what he wanted. Then she called me. Walking to that witness stand at 81 felt like walking onto a stage where I'd been rehearsing my whole life. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and I meant every word. Patricia asked me to explain my relationship to Bradley. I told the court he'd been my son-in-law for 6 years, that I'd welcomed him into my family, trusted him with my daughter's happiness and my grandchildren's well-being. She asked me to explain what I'd discovered about his conduct. I detailed the embezzlement from Hartwell Industries, the $43,000 in fraudulent expenses, the affair he'd conducted on company time using company money, the bank account he'd opened with his mistress using bonuses meant to support his family. Bradley's attorney objected that this was character assassination, that corporate matters had no bearing on custody. Judge Stevens said that a pattern of deception and financial misconduct absolutely had bearing on custody and child support. He told Patricia to continue. She asked me about the assault. I testified about getting Sophie's call at 1 in the morning, about finding my daughter with a split lip and bruises around her neck, about Bradley's threats to take the children if Sophie told anyone what he'd done. Then Patricia asked me the question we'd prepared. She asked if I believed Bradley Cooper should have custody of Lucas and Emma. I looked at Bradley directly, at this man who'd eaten at my table for 6 years while planning to rob my daughter blind, who'd hit her when she confronted his lies, who'd put on a sobriety performance while still drinking himself stupid at bars. I told the court that Bradley Cooper was a liar, a thief, and a violent man who'd proven he couldn't control his anger or his addictions, that he'd lied to his own attorney and to this court about his sobriety, that he'd stolen from the company that employed him, that he'd hit my daughter in the same house where my grandchildren were sleeping. I said that any man who would do those things didn't deserve unsupervised access to children, let alone custody. Bradley's attorney tried to discredit me. Asked if I wasn't just a bitter old woman who couldn't accept her daughter's marriage ending. Suggested I was using my money and influence to manipulate the proceedings. I looked at that attorney, and I smiled. I told him I was indeed an old woman, 81 years old. Old enough to have built a $100 million company from nothing, old enough to recognize a con artist when I saw one, and old enough to know that money and influence are only manipulation when they're used to support lies. When they're used to reveal truth, they're called justice. Judge Stevens actually smiled at that. The hearing ended 3 hours after it began. Judge Stevens said he'd review all evidence and issue a ruling within 48 hours. But I could tell from his face that he'd already made his decision. Walking out of that courthouse, Sophie grabbed my hand and squeezed it so tight it hurt my arthritis. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Bradley tried to catch up with us in the parking lot. Started to say something about how I'd pay for this, how his criminal attorney would use this hearing against us, how I'd regret destroying him. Richard stepped between us, told Bradley that if he came within 500 feet of any of us again, we'd have him arrested for violating the restraining order. Again, Bradley stood there in that parking lot, his perfect composure finally shattered, and I saw him for what he really was. Not a powerful man, not a threat, just a bully who'd finally met someone he couldn't intimidate. 2 days later, Judge Stevens issued his ruling. Bradley Cooper was denied all custody. He was granted supervised visitation only, 2 hours every other Sunday, with a court-appointed supervisor present. He was ordered to pay child support based on his previous Hartwell Industries salary, even though he was currently unemployed, and he was ordered to complete a minimum of 6 months of documented sobriety before even the supervised visitation could begin. Sophie called me crying when she got the news. Happy tears this time. She said she'd been so afraid, so certain that somehow Bradley would win, that the system would favor him because he was charming and convincing. I told her something I'd learned over 8 decades, that charm only works on people who want to be charmed, that judges who see evidence clearly don't care about performance, that truth, when you fight hard enough to present it, is more powerful than any lie. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about Robert, about how he'd always said that justice delayed isn't justice denied, it's just justice being thorough. Bradley had thought he could hit my daughter and threaten my family and get away with it because we were just women, one middle-aged and scared, one elderly and supposedly irrelevant. He'd learned that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Spring came early that year. By March, Sophie's garden was already blooming tulips and daffodils pushing through soil that had been frozen just weeks before. I sat on her back porch, watching Emma help her mother plant tomatoes while Lucas mowed the lawn, and I thought about rebirth, about how life finds a way to start over, even after the harshest winters. It had been 4 months since the custody hearing, 4 months that had brought more endings and more beginnings than I could have imagined. The criminal trial happened in February. Bradley's expensive attorneys tried every trick they could think of, delayed proceedings, filed motions, requested continuances, but Patricia Vance and our legal team were relentless. The evidence was overwhelming: $43,000 in documented fraud, testimony from colleagues who'd witnessed his falsified reports, bank records that couldn't be explained away. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts, Bradley was sentenced to 4 years in prison, eligible for parole after 2 if he demonstrated good behavior. His attorney argued for leniency, cited his remorse and his family obligations. The judge, a different one this time, a woman who'd read every detail of the case, said that men who steal from their employers and assault their wives have already demonstrated how little they value family obligations. I wasn't there for the sentencing. Sophie went, said she needed to see it herself, needed the closure. She told me Bradley had cried when they led him away, that his mother had sobbed in the gallery, that his father had left without looking back. I felt something when she told me that, not satisfaction exactly, not joy, just a quiet sense that the universe had balanced itself, that actions had consequences, that justice, real justice, sometimes actually happens. The divorce was finalized in March. Sophie got the house, full custody, child support that would be garnished from whatever wages Bradley earned after his release. She also got to reclaim her maiden name if she wanted. She'd decided to keep Cooper for now, because it was Lucas and Emma's name, and she didn't want to confuse them more than necessary. But she was thinking about it, thinking about going back to being Sophie Hartwell. I told her there was no rush, that names were just labels anyway, that she could be whoever she wanted to be. The thing that surprised me most was how quickly life normalized. Lucas's anxiety attacks stopped. Emma started smiling again, really smiling, the kind that reaches the eyes. Sophie went back to architecture full-time, joined a firm in White Plains that valued her talent. She'd even started dating someone, a nice man named Peter, who taught art history and had 2 teenagers of his own and didn't seem threatened by a woman with opinions. As for Hartwell Industries, Thomas and I had restructured Bradley's old department completely, promoted a woman named Janet Rodriguez who'd been overlooked for years because Bradley had taken credit for her ideas. Under her leadership, that region's sales had increased by 32%. Turned out Bradley hadn't just been useless, he'd been actively holding everyone else back. I'd also established something new, a foundation in Robert's name that provided legal assistance and financial support to domestic violence survivors. It was funded by the money Hartwell Industries had recovered from Bradley's fraud, plus a substantial contribution from my personal accounts. Patricia Vance ran it, and in just 3 months we'd helped 47 women leave dangerous situations, get restraining orders, filed charges against abusers. Every time I signed a check for that foundation, I thought about the woman I might have been if I'd been born in a different era, without resources, without the safety net that money provides. How many women are trapped because they can't afford to fight back? How many Sophies are still living with their Bradleys because escape seems impossible? If my money and my influence could change that for even a handful of women, then every dollar was worth it. But there were costs too, personal ones that surprised me. Bradley's parents had cut off all contact with me and Sophie. No more holiday dinners, no more phone calls, no relationship with Lucas and Emma. Patricia had sent a letter saying we'd destroyed their son and they wanted nothing to do with any of us. It hurt Sophie more than she admitted. She'd loved Bradley's parents, thought they were good people. Learning that they'd choose to defend their son rather than acknowledge what he'd done was a different kind of betrayal. I told her something I'd learned too many times over the years. Some people would rather believe comfortable lies than uncomfortable truths. That doesn't make them evil, just human, and very, very sad. There were also nights when my body reminded me I was 81, when my knees ached so badly I needed help getting out of chairs, when my hands were too stiff to open jars, when I looked in the mirror and saw someone ancient staring back, someone who'd lived too long and fought too hard and was just tired. But then Emma would call asking if I wanted to see her science project, or Lucas would text me articles about business history because he'd decided he wanted to study economics, or Sophie would stop by with coffee and sit at my kitchen table telling me about her day, about her new projects, about how Peter had made her laugh until she couldn't breathe, and I'd remember why the fight had been worth it. Last week, something happened that I hadn't expected. I got a letter from Amber Mitchell. She'd somehow found my address, written me 3 pages in careful handwriting, and I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won. I opened it. She apologized, said she'd been young and stupid and blinded by attention from someone who seemed sophisticated and successful. Said she hadn't known he was married at first. He'd told her he was divorced, and by the time she learned the truth, she was in too deep. Said she was ashamed of what she'd done, of the pain she'd caused Sophie and the children. She told me she'd moved to Colorado, gotten a job as a paralegal, was going to night school to become a lawyer specifically so she could help women in situations like the one she'd helped create. She said she thought about Sophie every day, hoped someday Sophie might forgive her, though she understood if that never happened. I read that letter 3 times. Then I wrote back, told her I appreciated the apology but that it needed to go to Sophie, not to me. Told her that actions matter more than words, and if she really wanted to make amends, she should become the kind of lawyer who protects women instead of destroying them. I also told her something I wished someone had told me when I was 26, that the men who seem most charming are often the most dangerous, and that real love doesn't require you to betray your own values. I don't know if she write to Sophie. I don't know if Sophie would read it if she did. But I mailed that letter hoping that maybe, somewhere down the line, one more woman would be a little bit wiser and a little bit stronger because of what we'd all been through. Today, sitting on Sophie's porch watching my grandchildren laugh and my daughter smile and the spring sun warm old bones that ache less when surrounded by people I love, I thought about what I'd tell my younger self if I could go back. I'd tell her that 81 isn't an ending. It's just another chapter, and sometimes the best ones come later in the book. I'd tell her that power isn't about being young or strong or loud, it's about knowing who you are and what you won't tolerate and having the courage to act on both. I'd tell her that men like Bradley exist in every generation, but so do women who refuse to let them win. Most of all, I'd tell her what I know now, that being called old, confused, irrelevant, or past your prime by someone who underestimates you isn't an insult, it's a strategic advantage. Because nothing is more dangerous than a woman who's lived long enough to learn every trick, patient enough to wait for the perfect moment, and powerful enough to destroy you while you're still figuring out what hit you. Bradley Cooper hit my daughter at 1 in the morning over his mistress. He went to prison. She's free, and I'm 81 years old, drinking tea in the sunshine, watching my family heal. Some people would call that revenge. I call it justice. And after 8 decades on this earth, I've learned they're often the same thing. You just have to be willing to fight long enough to see it through. If this story touched you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've got a grandmother, a mother, an aunt, or any woman in your life who's ever had to fight back against someone who thought she was too old or too weak to matter, share this with her. Let her know that age isn't weakness. It's accumulated power that people ignore at their own peril. Subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because every woman who's lived long enough has a tale about the day she stopped being underestimated and started being unstoppable. And those stories need to be told. Robert would be proud. My children are safe, my grandchildren are thriving. And somewhere, Bradley Cooper is learning that some lessons cost everything. I'd say that's a pretty good ending for a confused old lady who supposedly didn't understand how the world works. Turns out I understood it perfectly. I just let everyone think I didn't, and that made all the difference.